how likely is it that organisms will move from the primeval oceans onto land? Well, we can show it's inevitable. In the grand scheme of things, my sense is that there is likelihoods which may not be absolute inevitabilities, but are very, very high probabilities. And if that applies on this planet, so the argument goes, it should apply on other Earth-like planets and thereby hang another set of stories.
Welcome to the Purposeful Lab podcast, a podcast brought to you by the Magis Center. I'm Catherine Hadro, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Dan Kuebler. Good to see you again.
The same, Catherine. Good to be back with you.
Back from Ohio, here in good old Washington, D.C.
Yeah, it's always nice to come down and speak with you and speak with some guests.
Yes, absolutely. In this one, episode 3, we've discussed the cosmos. We've looked at the order of the universe and the galaxies in that sense. In this episode, we're focusing on evolution, which really is a specialty of yours.
Yeah, so we're moving from cosmological evolution, the evolution of the cosmos, to biological evolution, what's played out, the last 4 billion years on planet Earth.
I'm excited to listen into your interview with Dr. Simon Conway Morris. I know you spoke with him earlier. Tell us about what was at the heart of your conversation.
Yeah, I got to interview Dr. Simon Conway Morris, and one of his books, not one of the ones we talk about in the podcast. It's a book called Life Solutions: Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe. It's a book that really had an impact on the way I thought about evolution early on in my career, and maybe think about evolution from a different perspective, and particularly to see sort of the patterns and the convergence underlying evolution. And that got me sort of really interested in evolution in a way I hadn't been before.
And can you clarify that term, convergent evolution?
So convergent evolution is the idea that the similar sort of structures or behaviors evolve multiple times during the evolutionary process. So think about like powered flight. It didn't evolve just once in birds. It also evolved in other reptiles. It also evolved in insects and, the compound eye that you and I have that evolved multiple times, probably up to 7 different times. So this idea that there's some underlying structure to the universe, things we've talked about in previous episodes, this underlying physical and chemical structure of the universe sort of drives evolution repeatedly to the same sort of solutions. So one common example I always use is sort of protein evolution. And so the chemistry of the way proteins fold sort of drives them into certain forms over and over again. And so it's not just sort of an evolutionary free-for-all, for example, but there's sort of an underlying order or structure to the evolutionary process. So this is one of the things that we talked about at length during the interview.
Well, I know in the preparation for this podcast and taping this episode, there was a lot of excitement about getting to interview Dr. Simon Conway Morris. He really is a big deal, for those who aren't familiar with his work. And I just wanted to read through some of his credentials, so our listeners and viewers are aware. He again joined remotely from the UK. He's an English paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and astrobiologist, known for his study of the fossils of the Burgess Shale and the Cambrian explosion. Real quick, what is that?
Yeah, so the Burgess Shale is one of the key sort of fossil deposits of the Cambrian period, the Cambrian explosion. So this is a period about 540 million years ago. Within a span of about 5 million years or so, you see the appearance of all of the major animal phyla that we see around us. So like, the early chordates or vertebrates that were a member of that, arthropods, they all sort of show up, sort of this geological rapid time period. And it's one of these major sort of key events in the evolutionary history of life on Earth.
Okay, that's interesting. And currently, he's the emeritus professor of evolutionary paleobiology in the University of Cambridge and a fellow of St. John's College. He recently, as you mentioned, and as you demonstrated here, recently published From Extraterrestrials to Animal Minds, where he dismantles basically 6 myths of evolution, if you will. And he is a practicing Christian as well. Again, I know you've written a book on evolution, your book, The Evolution Controversy, a survey of competing theories. When did you get to be interested in this topic?
Yeah, evolution, I've always, from grad school on, it's hard to to go into biology without having some type of connection to evolutionary studies, because modern biology sort of doesn't make sense without having some evolutionary understanding of the cells, the organisms that you work with. But because evolution touches on so many non-scientific issues, philosophical issues, and theological issues, it's really one of my passions, because I see it as sort of a very key sort of question that goes to the heart of people that have very little interest maybe in science, but this often piques their interest because they think, oh, how does that relate to what man is and what's my purpose and so forth.
And I think you're going to be answering a lot of big questions in your conversation. Another note I wanted to make, though, for those if you're listening to our podcast and you've seen our podcast cover art, you might be wondering, okay, what is that bird on the logo? And it's the kiwi bird, and that has a huge connection to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, the kiwi bird is another example of convergence, and Dr. Simon Conway Morris and I talk about sort of the mammalian form and how robust it is, and the kiwi bird is an example of sort of this convergent evolution, because it's a bird and it's evolving a lot of mammalian characteristics. So its feathers look more like hair. It's nocturnal, which most birds aren't, so it evolved in the context of New Zealand, where there are no native mammals, but it's sort of trying to fill that mammal niche. It's an example of convergent evolution, something that we talk about in the interview.
No, that's excellent. And before we go to that interview, can you just also recap? You speak a lot about evolution and the order of evolution. And what's the term? Is it the arrow of evolution?
Yeah, we talk about the direction of evolution. So, as you look at the 4 billion year history of life on Earth, you see, sort of a pattern emerging, sort of a direction. And we talk about, is that direction real, or is it just an artifact? Is there sort of a trajectory, an arrow of evolution per se, or is it just sort of an artifact of chance?
Well, really interesting topic, a lot of big questions. Let's go to that interview now that you had with Dr. Simon Conway Morris.
Well, Dr. Simon Conway Morris, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on, and thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. I have a copy here of your most recent book, From Extraterrestrials to Animal Minds, 6 Myths of Evolution, that's recently come out. And this book picks up on some of the themes that you saw in some of your earlier books. I read Life Solutions, Inevitable Humans, and Alone the Universe. It's sort of a tour de force of looking at convergence and evolution, and so you see some of that in here as well. But before we jump into the book, I just want to, it says 6 myths of evolution. Just want to clarify, we're not talking about evolution as being a myth. It's clear that over the past 4 billion years on this planet, there's been an evolutionary process that has played out. But maybe you could just start by what was the purpose of writing this book and those myths? What were your goals here with this?
Well, to confirm, I've absolutely no doubt about the reality of evolution. So anybody else who is not on that page, they can turn off straight away. Thank you. In fact, I know quite a lot about the fossil record as well. But my interest is really that, by and large, in science, one's always interested in the unsolved problems rather than the things that you teach the undergraduates, which is fine because they will replace us pretty quickly. And as I often say in some of my lectures, if you think you're a cosmologist or an astronomer, then in the last 20 years, as you'll know, they've lost about 80% of the visible universe. And that's pretty good going. Well done. No dark matter, no dark energy. What on earth is going on? So there's something there to talk about. Whereas it seems to me that evolution has rather entered a closed space where lots of good work is being done by very clever and intelligent people. But somehow the bigger questions, if they actually exist, have been slightly to one side, and I think there are probably a number of reasons for this. One of them, actually, ironically, is technology. Everybody is drowning in data. There's superb machines which do almost everything you'd like, but of course there's a limit to the ability to assimilate all this and actually sort the wheat from the chaff and the rest of it. So this attempt at what I call myths, which, by the way, again, is not a dispute about the reality of evolution. It's certainly not talking about fairy tales, though we can talk about those if you like. It's areas of received wisdom, which, in my opinion, are long overdue for re-examination.
Well, excellent. Yeah. So one of the myths, and I think I want to start with this one that you talk about, is the myth of sort of randomness of evolution, right? And that's one of those things where clearly there's a lot of chance events that play out on the evolutionary process. Things that, hey, if this mutation hadn't happened at this particular time, evolution might have gone down a different direction. And so what is exactly sort of this myth of randomness that you said? Because clearly there are chance events that play out in the evolutionary process. And so what are you sort of getting at with that in terms of the myth of randomness there?
Well, as briefly as I can,
Yeah.
There's a paradox in as much as if you go to the one and only figure in Darwin's Origin of Species, it shows this set of steady diversifications. And indeed, pretty well, that's what we see in the fossil record. It's interrupted occasionally with mass extinctions. We might come back to those. But overall, things are becoming more and more diverse and more intricate and actually in many ways more interconnected. And that's all fine and large. But on the other hand, if you then look at the sorts of capabilities of organisms, and if you were a plant, you might say, well, what about transporting water up the stem? Or if you were a vertebrate, you might say, what about a larger brain? Or any other examples, warm-bloodedness, many other things can be taken. It turns out that all of those have evolved multiple times. So in a certain sense, it's a wood for the trees problem. If you're interested in the minutiae of evolution, then everything is actually unique. That's certainly the case. But if you're looking at the grand scheme of things, you find that again and again and again, unsurprisingly, in part because of physical constraints, the same solution has re-emerged. And then you step slightly back and say, well, how likely is it, for example, that organisms will move from the primeval oceans onto land? Well, we can show it's inevitable. How likely is it that some organisms will fly? Despite the extraordinary thinness of that fluid we call air, how likely is it that a number of groups will independently evolve large brains and other things such as vocalization? Again, we can return to that. And those are also convergent. And therefore, in the grand scheme of things, my sense is that there is likelihoods, which may not be absolute inevitabilities, but are very, very high probabilities. And if that applies on this planet, so the argument goes, it should apply on other Earth-like planets and thereby hang another set of stories.
Yeah. So you mentioned there the convergent nature of the evolutionary process, right? And so, yeah, you see powered flight evolve multiple times. Now, does that suggest to you, so you could argue, well, it's just, over a course of 4 billion years, just by chance, you're going to get certain things that crop up multiple times. And there's nothing really to see here in terms of convergence. It's just sort of chance, events that have occurred. And anytime you run a complex process for a real long period of time, you might see certain things repeat. But it seems like you're arguing more that there's sort of an underlying pattern that you might see in evolution, where you say, yeah, this is predictable. Is that sort of where you would fall?
Indeed it is, and by and large, most scientists are very much in favor of predictability. That's in fact what we're meant to be doing. Right. And I would say, and this is almost a sort of sociological point, but early on when I was really into the area of convergence, and I'm still very interested, of course, in this area, I was very struck by the adjectives which, mainstream scientists, hard-headed individuals used again and again. And these are words of surprise. So they have words associated with the discovery of a particular example of convergence, such as uncanny or remarkable or astonishing. And then from my Darwinian perspective, I think, goodness sake, what's all the fuss about? This is adaptation. Come on, grow up. Of course, these things are being organized in such a fashion that they've got to function in an effective way. And it is, I think, particularly interesting, if I might give the classic example of convergence. I think it's a legitimate one, and that's the similarity between our eye as a vertebrate and those are the octopus and the squid, which are distantly related to us. And anybody who's done first year zoology will know that to the first approximation, these eyes are almost identical. But then when you look in the details, and we don't have time to talk about them unless you so wish, it turns out there are all sorts of subtle differences. But what is fascinating is that in each and every case, what appears to be an apparent disadvantage or advantage, for example, in the octopus, the retina is on the outmost part of the cells, whereas our retina, of course, is buried underneath another layer of the cells because we derive it from the brain. But in that particular case, what appears to be actually a drawback and a disadvantage and rather sloppy design actually is solved in a truly brilliant way. And therefore, in the longer term, it really doesn't matter whether you've got the eye of an octopus or whether you've got the eye of a human. From the perspective of the eye, I'm not saying much about the brain yet, they will work in, for all intents and purposes, an identical fashion.
Yeah, and the reason that they would work in an identical fashion would be because they both have to do the same thing. The properties of light are the same for every organism. Is that sort of like that's why you're not going to have flying elephants, right? There's physical constraints that you're not going to be able to generate enough lift to get something that large based on But those are the type of things that are written into the physics and chemistry of the planet.
Yes, I think so. And in fact, you talk about flying elephants. Well, I'll give you flying elephants if you want to, but unfortunately, I've got to do a deal with you. We've got to have a planet which has got a much more thick atmosphere. And if you go to Venus, for instance, the atmosphere on the surface is about equivalent in terms of pressure to a kilometer of seawater. Now, nobody wants to go to Venus. It's a kind of hot, fairly hostile place. But you can certainly envisage Earth-like planets which have rather different atmospheres, and if indeed they were more viscous, effectively, if they were thicker, then something substantially larger in principle could fly. So, but again, we can play with the physics and we understand things called Reynolds numbers and all these good things. And those, again, will provide a series of parameters which will allow us to, once again, constrain in an apparently alien environment what something actually turns out to be on the same principles we find here on Earth.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you use the term sort of inevitability there in your previous book, and you brought it up again. So it's not necessarily inevitable, but a high probability of certain things emerging evolutionarily, given the constraints that there are there on planet Earth. And I've heard some people refer to this as sort of the possible solutions are like Platonic forms that are written into the physics and chemistry and the process of evolution. Even though there's a lot of chance elements there, that is to uncover these possibilities. And I think you would argue that there's relatively limited possibilities to make a living on planet Earth, given the constraints that you have to operate under. Is that what you would argue? And what is there a good example that sort of if someone were to say, well, how would you come to that conclusion? What would you say?
Well, unfortunately, as indeed any of my critics would very fairly point out, Earth, so to speak, is one.
Right.
There's one origin of life so far as we know. And there are, for example, good arguments that there are various sort of either tipping points or so-called bottlenecks, whereby by a series of chance events, things which might have come together otherwise in a fairly unexceptional way, actually just didn't happen. But my sense from the overall understanding of convergence to begin with is, well, there are two things. First of all, and again, I could give you some classic examples from molecular biology, whereby you have particular systems which are extremely efficient, and yet it turns out they've evolved multiple times. And everybody's got to use them, but you don't always have to use the same origin, so to speak. It doesn't really matter very much. So that's one aspect of it. And the second thing, which I think is slightly neglected, is that a good deal of the heavy lifting which you require to make complex structures like an eye have actually evolved long before there was even an animal. So in the classic example of the eyes, and I'm sorry, I do tend to repeat myself here, but it's such an elegant example. Yeah. Our eyes, actually, I point at this eye, and of course it's no longer got the crystallines in because it's got a plastic lens we call a cataract operation. It's working very nicely, thank you. But the other eye is still working okay on its original proteins, and these are called crystallines. Good name for transparent proteins. And these are ultimately derived from microbes. So they've evolved in microbial systems for a completely different function, and they have been recruited. And this is something we see again and again and again. So it's not really a sort of cripplingly difficult question about evolutionary novelty. And you can see why some people who are anti-Darwinian appeal to this line of argument. But it's more like a factory floor where there's an awful lot of material lying around on various benches and lathes and all the rest of it. And the trick is to get them to come together.
Yeah. So if you look at, on that line there, if you look at like a single cell organisms, you have a lot of these sort of proteins that are used for specific purposes in these single cell organisms. But when you get to multicellular organisms with different tissues and so forth, those proteins are now used in novel ways that, it wasn't as if they appear for those novel uses, but they can be co-opted for those. And it seems, is there a level of sort of chance there and randomness or is it just the modularity of these things, almost like Legos? You can shuffle them around to do all kinds of building with them. So you got all the building blocks there early on in, say, the evolutionary process, at least the molecular building blocks that then can be shuffled around to build all kinds of interesting three-dimensional forms. Right. Is that I know you've done obviously your work in the Cambrian explosion, looking at sort of these the Burgess shell, these three-dimensional animals. A lot of them, these different forms, are built on the same building blocks, even though they have different sort of developmental pathways, right? But the underlying protein structures a lot of times are the same. Is that?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, and again, there are two aspects. Very, very briefly, to go back to the crystallines, it turns out even amongst the vertebrates that there are lots and lots of different crystallines which have been derived from different, mostly microbial organisms. They're highly convergent. And I don't quite understand why. You think of a group like ourselves, which we know have a common ancestor around about 550 million years ago. Why keep on recruiting different crystallines in different groups? As far as I know, nobody's really sort of tackled that particular question. And then the second point you make is, I think, of even greater importance, and that is just the sheer versatility of molecular systems, in as much as you'll find repeatedly something which has a canonical status in one set of operations, like the ones which work in our retina, for example, are recruited in all sorts of different contexts. And again, from a certain level, of course, the molecule doesn't know what it's doing, or at least we hope not. But of course, the biochemical configuration which requires it to do something in a particular context will lend itself to that recruitment in something which is, if you like, entirely unrelated to what might have been either its original function or another function in the same organism.
Yeah, some people have called that sort of the evolution of evolvability. That there's, that the evolutionary process favors things that allow for more flexibility, in a sense. Or is that go along with convergence? Is that an aspect of why there is convergence, you think? Or?
Well, I think it is. I mean, the trouble is that we know a great deal more than when I started as an undergraduate, in particular, about the way that the developmental systems work. But in point of fact, even now, when you see a speeded up video of an embryo developing, it's absolutely astonishing the way that the cells migrate and move around, and some die, and all the rest of it. And I'm not saying there's anything sort of deeply inexplicable about this, but the speed at which these things happen lends many people to suggest that the genes are obviously playing a part in all this, but there are other factors also at work. And people, I'm not an expert here at all, I'm talk rather vaguely of self-organization. So these things tend to, if I use the word crystallize, that's exactly the wrong word, because that's precisely what organisms aren't. They avoid sort of turning into these static modules.
Right.
But there are whole aspects about the way the development of these things unfolds, which it's really very remarkable. I'm not going to put it more strongly than that.
Yeah. No, I think there's this interplay between the environment and the environmental constraints and the genes that can lead to some convergence, because the environment a lot of the environmental factors are not going to change. And so they can be used in sort of different ways. One of the other myths you talk about in here is the myth of extinctions. Again, not that you disagree that there were mass extinctions, but the notion that, and I get this from students when I teach about evolution, I think, well, if there's an extinction event, that totally resets the evolutionary sort of playing field. And so now all bets are off. What survived is there's an element of chance, randomness, so who knows which way it's going to go after this mass extinction event. And then 100 million years later is another one, and that resets. And so that, in first sort of principles, people think, oh, if mass extinctions are feeding into the randomness or chance elements of evolution. So if there wasn't this mass extinction event, we would have never gone in this direction. But it seems, in your book, you talk about how that's sort of an improper way of looking at, not the way you think we should look at mass extinction events. So if you want to just elaborate on clarify a student that would come and say that to you, what would you respond to them?
Well, it'd be a pleasure, of course. It's great, as we both know, to teach mass extinctions is just terrifically interesting. Not least because just the sheer range of scientific evidence. If you're looking at the end of the dinosaurs, it's very good to know something about the asteroid belt. It's also very useful to know about an element called iridium. It's also very useful to know about what happens when you pulverize quartz at very high pressures and so-called shocked quartz, etc., etc., etc. So it's a great area to teach. But the canonical view, and we can indeed think of the so-called end Cretaceous extinction about 65 million years ago, though in my opinion, that applies to all the other mass extinctions, is that this totally reset the agenda. The dinosaurs are dominating, along with various of the reptiles, the mammals, these sort of shy, retiring, nocturnal beasts who spend most of their time trying to avoid either being eaten by dinosaurs or trodden on them, which is more miserable end, I ask you. There we go. That's the way we go. And then the lucky asteroid, or the Deccan volcanics, whichever you like, or maybe both, all step into action, and the world is cleared. The ecosystems are available for new occupation, and off we go. And sure enough, within 20 million years, more or less, we've got bats and whales and chaps who are not only in the trees, but looking suspiciously like real primates. So that's where we fit in. So all good news. The problem with this, and it's something which is equally well known, is, of course, that the mammals are doing fine in the Cretaceous. In fact, they're beginning to diversify. And in fact, their origins go back into the preceding interval, we call the Jurassic. And the basic division, not only between the placentals and marsupials, the principal groups of mammals, but also some of the major groups of the mammals which will indeed inherit the world after the disappearance of the dinosaurs, are already there. They're already diversifying. And the dinosaurs are, in fact, in my view, dominant, but not forever. So let's imagine that the mass extinction, for whatever reason, didn't happen. The mammals are effectively cleverer. They're more social. They're warm-blooded, discussed about the dinosaurs, I realize that. And amongst the other things, and this also applies to an extent to the birds as well, which are convergent in some ways on the mammals, some mammals end up using tools. So we can have a counterfactual world. Because the trajectories have already been established long before the mass extinction, then the dinosaurs are going to disappear for one reason or another. And in fact, it would probably be contributed to by climate change, not global warming, no, global cooling. Because, of course, in the tertiary, the planet goes into a series of major glaciations. And in that particular context, although the tropics would have remained rich in reptiles, as they are to the present day with snakes and lizards, the temperate and polar zones are not the areas where, by and large, the relatively cold-blooded dinosaurs are going to do very well. So the argument, in a sense, is that actually, and this is what I like about a paradox, is that mass extinctions are creative. They're absolutely dreadful on the day. Nobody wants to be there. They're absolutely appalling. But in the longer term, all they do is they accelerate what's going to happen in any case. The mammals are going to take over the world. If you give me a mass extinction, I get 50 million years free for nothing. And for that, I should say thank you. So, 100,000 years of, pretty ghastly conditions. But after that, we're on our way. But we would have got there sooner or later. But there's a slight corollary to this, and that is that, let us say we've got 5 mass extinctions, roughly, maybe more, doesn't matter. And each one, for the sake of argument, gives us 50 million years for nothing. Well, if you look at the projections for the future of the biosphere in terms of habitability, then actually we have roughly 800 billion years less, give or take. And of course, we could talk into other possibilities of migration, whatever. So the point is that actually we're getting something like 200 million years of accelerated evolution free. And this could be important.
Yeah. So in a sense, the mammalian form is going to win out, given the changing environment that it's always going to be happening on planet Earth. And sooner or later, it's going to overcome anything that's already there, sort of well well established.
Don't misunderstand. Yeah, I don't misunderstand. I'm not anti-reptile.
Right.
Sweet creatures, And look, if you look at the diversity of snakes today, which also show fabulous examples of convergence, and they're absolutely, and lizards even better. Terrific. What they do jolly well. But they just don't, by and large, have. They're actually, the lizards are a nice example because most of them, like other reptiles, lay eggs. But independently, a number of them have evolved live birth. They have placentas inside the female. And those, in certain cases, are incredibly similar to the mammalian placenta. And that, too, again, gives me reassurance that if you're going to nurture your young within the body, then something like a placenta is very much on the cards. And in the grand scheme of things, I really don't mind as a biologist who's got the placenta.
Right. So that's something that's going to evolve eventually because it's if the mammalian form is got these advantages, then it's going to crop up not only in our true mammals, but sort of pseudo mammals in these these reptiles, or say the kiwi bird or things like that, where you see sort of this pseudo mammalianness because that's a good way of making a living in a changing environment.
That's right.
Yeah. So you talk about the inevitability, or this is a sort of projection is drive towards, in your earlier book, Inevitable Humans, right, in a lonely universe. I want to hit on both of those things, the inevitability of humans and the lonely universe there, both of those there. One of them is this idea that once you get the evolutionary process started, you seem to argue that getting a large-brained social organism like you and I is something that's almost inevitable. And it seems that suggests an underlying pattern or direction to evolution. Do you see an underlying direction or pattern? Again, we are getting a lot of people argue, is evolution increasing in complexity over time? And that's just a loaded word, complexity, because it's really hard biologically to exactly define that. But let's say if we define it as sort of increased cellular properties and increased complexity of behaviors, you sort of see that, at least evolutionary. Is that an artifact, or is that something you think is inevitable, right?
My sense is that there's two things which are probably unrelated. The first is that, so far as I can see, in terms of not only the overall diversity, convergence notwithstanding, the degrees of integration and ecological complexity have increased through geological time. And again, in the book you kindly mentioned at the beginning, we can deal with these astonishing examples of symbiotic association, some of the ones which are involved with insects and bacteria. Extremely intimate. I mean, where they're actually providing quite a lot of the proteins which the insect needs. They synthesize the proteins which are essential for the insect, or the amino acids to be more precise. So, and you can take similar examples of something which is akin to farming in some of the ants and all the rest of it. And all of these are depending on very intricate and intimate interassociations of different species. And that is something which you can clearly see from the fossil record, was for the most part not present in the time of the dinosaurs, for instance, but has evolved subsequently. So that's one aspect to it. And I think overall, the world has become increasingly richer and more diverse. But, of course, not the drawback, the thing worth mentioning, of course, is that to the first approximation, the only people who care about that are us. Nobody else, all the other animals wandering around sometimes having pretty miserable lives. I could say something unhealthy about chimpanzees in a moment if you so wish. But we're the only ones with the curiosity to sort of say, well, this is all jolly interesting. And, not only do we want to know where we come from, but we want to know how all these other systems work. And, of course, that's all part of the scientific investigation and all the rest of it. But that's not actually trivial because without us, peering around, looking through our microscopes and all the other sorts of things, all this would have remained, at least so far as we can tell, unobserved. So, yes, I think the world is an astonishingly beautiful place, but we're the only people who know it.
Yeah. Well, do you think that we've hit a limit in terms of human evolution, or is there, obviously there's certain evolutionary processes going on in human populations, that much is clear, but in terms of sort of a significant development in, say, brain size or behavior? Do you think are humans hit a limit? I mean, because you do see that sort of in evolutionary trajectories where you get sort of over specialization, you hit a limit, can't really go beyond. What do you, I always, again, this is one of these questions students always ask me, where are humans evolving to next? And I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Gosh, well, where do we begin? I wonder if your director could give us another 3 hours. That would be very helpful. Thank you. Well, I think the story goes back more than 3 million years. And effectively, excuse me, it's to do with the first stone tools which we're making. Now, to be sure, we were probably using other tools, including ones made of wood, maybe before that. But the general argument is, not accepted by everybody, that the lithics, as we call them, which the chimpanzees use in various contexts, are not the same as ours. There's something going on with the making of the older one tools in particular, and some slightly earlier ones as well, which suggests that somehow we're seeing into the stone, if you like. Now, this is putting it in a very sort of clumsy way, but in a more precise way, what it means is that from a very early stage, through a whole succession of species, we've been showing various sorts of technologies. And it is the case that a number of animals use tools, but crucially, to the first approximation, for example, no animal makes one tool in order to make another tool. And correspondingly, animals learn, but they never teach. Whereas we can get into the mind of the pupil, sometimes, not always, I grant you, and thereby understand not only that they're cleverer than we are, but they join the conversation very quickly. So in that perspective, really from an early stage of human evolution, all bets have been off. Because, again, we are the ones which have become self-aware. We can discuss whether that applies to animals in one form or another, but it's fairly patently that we are looking pretty different. And the way in which you can see that our understanding of the world, and this is going into metaphysical territory, but let's go completely off piece now. And amongst the many people I'm interested in, as you can probably gather looking behind me, is a man called Owen Barfield, who was a friend of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. He was one of the Inklings. And he was a remarkable man because he had very interesting ideas about the origin of language, which is something which is also unique to us. We don't have to talk about that. But another thing he believed was the case, that human consciousness has evolved. In other words, if you go back even to medieval times, let alone into Roman or even pre-classical times, the people then were as intelligent as we are, but they genuinely saw the world in a different way. They interpreted it differently. And it wasn't simply that they weren't scientists. They had a whole different world picture, which is why it's so difficult for us to project ourselves back into these times. It takes a real effort of imagination. Again, what a machine will never do. But what it means is that there is a future, but Barfield actually was cautiously optimistic in this way. He wrote some dystopian novels, which were suggesting things which weren't too pretty. But my view would be that actually that there are further developments around the corner. And because happily, I can write this down in big letters if you like, nobody knows what consciousness is at all. Nobody. Don't believe what they tell you. It's completely mysterious. If we got to even 10% understanding, then I would begin to relax, but we don't. And as and when we begin to solve that one, I have a few ideas, then we might have that conversation which you just started.
Yeah.
Well, I've gone on for too long.
No, that's great. It's this cultural evolution. You're talking about the mind, the medievals and the way they saw the world. Or the Roman, the Greeks of antiquity, how they saw the world. It's very easy for us to look back and laugh at how they saw the world, but there's a certain mindset that they had where they would probably look at us and laugh that we don't the way we understand. Sort of particularly nature is just being something that we want to mathematize often, and sometimes they have sometimes a richer understanding of certain aspects of nature and of reality because they see it through a different lens, and that I think is something that you talk about. At least in the book, the difference between animal minds and human minds, and this it was a great segue what you just talked about to that myth there, which I think. Amongst mainstream scientists is probably the most controversial myth that you have in the book, this myth of animal minds. And you're not arguing, again, that animals don't have minds and animals aren't conscious, but that there is a fundamental sort of difference in kind between, say, an animal mind and what, say, a chimp can do, and a human mind. And you hit on a couple of those things there, and you can see how it's related to AI and how the idea that AI will not have a human mind because there's something different in kind. If you want to just sort of elaborate on the difference between human and animal minds, if you had to pinpoint one or two key things that humans do,
right?
And all these are interconnected. So you pull one of them, and they're all connected to things that humans do. But is there something to say that's what a human mind can do, and that's what animals can't?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned teaching and language, and we could return to those if necessary. But one which is apparently very trivial, and I only came across it relatively recently. I'm reading quite actively into this area. Is that animals, especially social animals, quite often are separated. Chimpanzees, dolphins, things like that. They live in so-called fission fusion communities, whereby small groups tend to hang together for a reasonably long period of time, but other ones wander off, sometimes a month, even longer, and then they come back to the group in one context or another. And when they return to the first approximation, they're all greeted enthusiastically. They're delighted to see each other. The sort of metaphorical shaking of hands and hugging and all the rest of it. What happened? Where were you? All these sort of, debriefings going on. But animals never ever say farewell. So when some animal wanders off, they don't give them a hug and say, take care of yourself and something. So the animal equivalent of the arrival halls are always packed, but the animal equivalent of the departure halls are always deserted. There's nobody there at all. And I think effectively what this is telling us is that animals have no concept of future. And this is actually related in the end to their ability to imagine things. So they have memories. And there's a lot of discussion as to whether they actually have what we call a sort of specific, sort of episodic memory, whereby we can remember that Christmas what happened to Uncle Jack on that day. And there's a strong suspicion they don't have that, because for them, memories are something which, especially in animals which hide food, for example, are essential for their survival, but nothing else. Now, memory is important when they're dealing with a group of individuals, and there's a whole hierarchy, and I mentioned in passing that you don't want to be, I'm not going to talk about reincarnation, but if there's any sort of reincarnation, if it involves coming back as a chimpanzee, count me out immediately. As pointed out in another paper I was reading very recently, it's a pretty ghastly life. It's brutal and unpleasant and dominated by some extraordinarily unpleasant individuals. And that's the way the social organization has to be. So I've got nothing against chimpanzees. They're fascinating creatures. But don't delude yourselves that they are in any sense human. We came from a similar organism beyond a shadow of doubt, but something in us has changed. And I don't understand, unless I go into metaphysical territory, what that actually is. But it is essentially several things. One is that we can deal with abstractions. We can have unobservable properties. And here I tip my hat very strongly to a chap called Dan Povinelli, who I've not had the pleasure of meeting by reading a lot of it. He's an animal behaviorist. I've been reading a lot of his papers recently, and I think they're cracking good. And he's very skeptical about the idea that animals have what we call a theory of mind. In other words, that they perfectly clearly understand what other animals are doing. They can work out their intentions. They can work out their emotions, not in dispute at all. But what they can't do is get into the mind of the other individual. So they can't actually themselves become an actor. And that again tells me a great deal about the dissimilarity between us and things like AI technology, because only we would want to be actors. You think about it for a moment. Why on earth do people go to the theatre? I mean, what an absurd thing to do. But we know perfectly well why. Because in a sense, we're being taken out of ourselves. Why do we read books? Because we're being taken out of ourselves. And all of this, as you said, is interconnected. You can't really take one aspect of human uniqueness away from another one. So collectively, it's the problem, I think, is I'm not doing down animals at all. They are doing what they do superbly well. And they're incredibly impressive. And in many respects, what they can do is something which we could never do in terms of speed, in terms of understanding about the threats of the surrounding environment. But what is neglected is just how, in my view, how utterly peculiar we are. We are most odd, because here we are having this conversation.
Yeah, that sort of desire for meaning and understanding of what's going on around you and what's going on in your mind. I'm looking at you, seeing you on the screen, and wonder what are you thinking about? And I know what you're thinking is different than what I'm thinking.
I hope
so. But there is, it's certainly within evolutionary biology, this sense that there's this continuity, right, between humans and other hominids and sort of common ancestor of humans and chimps. So you have this continuity, but then you have this sort of mental discontinuity on top of that. And what would your response to be to someone who would argue, like Darwin did, that all of the mental properties or mental abilities of humans is there in sort of this rudimentary form, the emotional expressions of chimps, and this sort of rudimentary language and so forth, or calls that or sounds that people, different organisms interpret for meaning, quote unquote. That all of that is there, and there's a point in the evolutionary process where a certain mutation occurs, a certain gene, and voila, you've got the creature that now can mentally time travel and can look at someone else. So do you think that there is an evolutionary, a biological basis? I mean, clearly there is a biological basis for our brain is at least to some extent needed for conscious experience. But can you explain human consciousness physically, right, and human behavior, or is that from a metaphysical perspective something you don't think is possible? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Gosh, here we go. So no dispute about the continuity in terms of the Darwinian aspects, of course not. No. And the fossil record, apart from as well as the genetics, I'll show that convincingly enough. And indeed, Darwin was insistent, for rather good reasons, actually, of his own, that's another story, that these differences, such as anybody would agree, were simply ones of degree, but not of kind. And how else could it possibly be, except that when you take each one of these individual characters which make us human, when you start to dig into the animals, so to speak, it's terribly difficult to find anything there which is really convincing as a precursor. And I think this is the most obvious is language, because certainly animals vocalize. And there are many, many attempts to persuade people that various vocalizations, the vervet monkeys are the favorite example, but there are other ones as well, have got, if you like, proto-words. But I think the problem with this is that, once again, we forget who we are. So that when we make these comparisons, and people in some ways are even more enthusiastic about birdsong, which in certain respects is more convincingly like language than the primates. So the apes actually aren't great vocalizers. They gesture more. But the monkeys are certainly very noisy. What we forget is that although you and I are using language and the words are pouring out of the mouth, and the ears are receiving all the rest of it, we take a rather superficial view of this, because, of course, we use language in all sorts of ways which they shouldn't be. Especially these days, we use irony. Oh, dear me. We joke. Oh, no, can't have that either. Oh, tut. And all of these things, in as much as writing books or writing poetry or writing to your friends, is deeply cognitive. It's all an aspect of who we are. And these things simply are not present in that form in animals at all. And this applies to, I think, all other aspects of what we see. And again, to insist again, I'm not trying to do the animals down at all, very much the reverse. And there's no doubt that there are things which allow them to convey information. That's absolutely fine. If you're living in the jungle, it'd be a sad case if they weren't able to do that. But the crucial thing is, which I think I already hinted at, is that we can imagine unobservables, as Povinelli points out in particular, but also other people, but also that we deal with abstractions. So, for instance, with a huge amount of training, and this is something which is neglected when you describe this work of animal behavior. By and large, the amount of training you have to do is staggeringly large, and there are all sorts of little loopholes, and you have to read the fine print in these papers to discover that they're really quite sort of elastic about what they will permit the animal to be allowed to do, and thereby claim that it's human-like. There's also a very strong pressure, of course, to describe in the scientific literature human-like behavior. But if it's not human-like, then it's neglected. That's never reported at all. And other people have pointed out this as well. And it's a sort of subtle, well, if I use the word censorship, of course, we're going to be in terribly deep territory straight away. And I don't mean it in that sort of way, but there's a whole world picture, which I think is, as I mentioned right at the beginning, is long overdue for reinvestigation in this area. So linked to that is that with a huge amount of effort, you can teach a chimpanzee or a bonobo sign language or some sort of elements of mathematics. But it takes a colossal amount of effort, which you never see in the wild. And the point is that these animals, when they achieve these things, are always in the company of humans. And this is a larger problem because animals which live in the company of humans, often, almost like a family in some cases, the chimpanzees and the bonobos, are what we call enculturated. And so, for example, one of the key tests, one would argue, for being able to recognize oneself as a self is to look in a mirror and say, oh, there you are. Oh, well done, better shave today, and this sort of thing. And indeed, some species, not all, can recognize themselves in mirrors. But it's been pointed out that for all intents and purposes, this capacity is restricted to animals which are enculturated. Enculturated animals tend to be somewhat smarter, but that's as far as they ever get. They get further than their friends in the wild. So in the wild, you'll never see a chimpanzee looking in a pool of water and say, oh, that's right, I'm handsome today, and all the rest of that. Yeah. So and I think that the thing is, Purposeful Lab, as it says on your thing there, is that if you're dealing with a metaphysics which deals with the reality of abstractions which are real and that we either encounter or are gifted or whatever, then one enters completely new universes, which again is why AI might be able to help us in certain circumstances. But I wouldn't worry about AI describing those abstractions by itself. It can't. They have no capacity to do that at all.
Yeah, you talk about the need for sort of a metaphysical change in terms of the way people look at these questions or metaphysical reframing. What do you think it is driving? Because there's a lot of research on this, trying to get animals to show that they have rudimentary aspects of language or tool use. So, but as you point out, there's a lot of effort and time put into this and very little coming out the other end that shows unambiguous that's human-like behavior, right? What is it, do you think, that's fueling that drive there to demonstrate this when in as you say you think there's a metaphysical reason that maybe you're not going to be able to see this, right?
I'm very pleased. I'm the foggiest idea, of course. Yeah. I don't know. In a sense, I mean, what I do know, and of course, I'm relatively being very lucky in my life, and where I've worked and all the rest of it, and also having a rather overwhelming sense of curiosity and other such things. My sense is that when I'm reading the literature at the moment, there's an awful lot of special pleading going on at the moment, in particular. And when I mentioned the example about animals never saying farewell, well, I wasn't quite getting that right, was I? Because actually a recently published paper suggests that baboons, which are fairly far down the primate scale, do show farewell gestures. But actually, without going into all the gory details, you don't even have to read between the lines to suggest that in effect, what they've done is they've changed the definitions. So anything which almost is a sort of body contact can be interpreted as a farewell. Well, I mean, if we're going to play this game, we can go wherever we like. And I think this problem again is the reading into animals through an anthropomorphic lens. And everybody who works in this area is fully aware of the risks of this. But it is incredibly difficult to see these animals in any context except our own context. Yeah. So it might be difficult enough to get into the mind of a Roman, but as we have, he's a bit crock these days, but when I used to do interviews like this in the last few years, the dog would wander in and become a star show at one point. When I sort of think, how on earth do I get into the mind of my dog? I really think I don't think I can do this. I know how he behaves and all the rest of it. I can have some inkling of that, but in this sort of way, one's got to understand that these animals, from their perspective, are, especially if they are well looked after, are happy, content, and have interesting lives. Dogs, in particular, lucky thing. Well, of course, they turned up 30,000 years ago. We did a deal. We gave them chow 2 times a day, and they fetched sticks for us. So who's to complain?
It was a great deal.
But yeah, exactly. But their worlds are fantastically circumscribed. But of course, our problem is, of course, we see it in the sort of sense thinking, "Gosh, supposing I was like that," and we can't really get ourselves into that mental frame at all. No. So it's really difficult. No, I don't know. I was saying my sense is that the abstractions themselves, which are familiar to philosophers, or some philosophers in any case, and to metaphysicians and to theologians, are absolutely real. They're not inventions of the human mind any more than our consciousness is solely within our brains.
Right. No, that's great. I mean, I think you're right that it's really hard to get out of our own minds. So it's like when we think of being a dog, I think of me being a dog. So it's not, I can't approach what it's like to be a dog. It's Dan being a dog, which is totally different than being a dog, right? So it's very difficult to get into that mindset. I really appreciate you coming on in your time. I just want to finish here with like 1 or 2 more questions, sort of meta questions on you stand back and look at sort of the evolutionary process and this convergence that you talk about in this underlying order and say inevitability. Do you see an underlying, does that, obviously scientifically you can't say, oh, here's the purpose of the universe, here's the purpose of my life, but does that resonate in any way with you? Does it make you look at the world differently than if you just see it as a chance, as a chance encounter? Does that change the way you view the world, from a philosophical perspective, right? Yeah.
Oh yeah, yes, it does. Of course, I would sort of not turn the tables on you. Far from it. But I'd be fairly hard pushed to find anybody who doesn't have some strong sense of purpose. As we say, in the Greek term, telos. And hence teleological and all the rest of it. And biologists are particularly amusing in this area because, of course, they're dealing with organisms which, on a day-to-day basis, spend their entire time apparently doing things for a purposeful reason. So there's a lot of twisting and dodging going on there. And I don't particularly think, that my dog in particular has a sense of purpose in the way we would identify it. Where I'd be more nervous, in particular, is having these concepts which are difficult enough to explain even at length, to have them hijacked. Because apart from anything else, and I think this is one reason why Stephen Jay Gould, who was very generous with some of my work, was so nervous about something which might end up looking as a deterministic explanation, is it might mean one group or other might sort of say, well, we were meant to be here and you weren't, and we all know what happens after that. Thank you very much. Welcome to Europe 1939 or anywhere else and the rest of it. But despite that, I think scientists as a whole would be happy with the idea that the world is very strangely and highly ordered. And the very fact that we as humans can begin to interrogate even some small fraction of that, within it, as I mentioned in passing, see a beauty to it. And then as Tolkien in particular, the friend of Barfield, felt as a so-called sub-creator, that in a way he was not doing God's work for him, but he was echoing, however distantly, that sense of why the creation is so wonderful. Fallen, dangerous, full of ghastly people like Sauron, but still wonderfully beautiful. And that, I think, incidentally, not amongst my scientific friends, but that, I think, is why Tolkien's work, and especially The Lord of the Rings, has resonated so incredibly deeply with so many people. They might not always want to articulate it particularly clearly, but the very fact that it sends the chattering classes round the bend gives me enormous encouragement.
Yeah, well, great. I want that's a great place to end our conversation, and just wanted to mention the book again. It's From Extraterrestrials to Animal Minds, 6 Myths of Evolution. And it's a great read, and particularly a lot of some of, I think out of the box thinking in a couple of these chapters. We never got to talk about extraterrestrials much, but people can read the book and they can get your take on that. So,
Sure.
Dr. Simon Conway Morris, thank you for your time, and we appreciate having you on here.
My great pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Wow, that was a packed conversation. I love Dr. Simon Conway Morris. Definitely has some dry British humor. You can tell, and it came through. And he was a great teacher as well. I learned a lot from that. What are your immediate reactions and thoughts to speaking with him?
Yeah, it's interesting how he touches on so many different things that are related to evolution, but also related to a lot of other things like AI and the difference between animal minds and human minds and so forth. I just think the depth that he has, in terms of, he's done, his specialty was on a specific set of fossils from the Cambrian period, but I think he's really well versed now in, the whole theory of, animal behavior and animal minds and human minds, and and he's done quite a bit of research and reading on that, as you can see from all the books behind him, as he talked about in the interview. Yeah,
an impressive library. There was this was a huge theme in the beginning of your conversation with him. So I want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly and that our listeners are as well. The aspect of convergent evolution. Can you again just quickly redefine that? That way we all make sure we're understanding it correctly.
Yeah, with convergent evolution, it's the idea again that you reach sort of similar solutions over and over again during the evolutionary process. And one of the famous thought experiments about this is what would happen if you could rerun the evolutionary tape. We could go back and rerun evolution on our planet. And there's sort of 2 extremes. There's the one idea, if you reran it again, you get something totally, totally different, right? And that's the idea that evolution is totally contingent, that chance events dominate. The other extreme is the idea, if we reran it again, we get something very similar, right? And the reason is because you'd be rerunning evolution, as we talked about in the interview, on the same Earth with the same sort of physical forces and the same sort of chemistry, that would dictate certain solutions. Now, the timing of when they might appear and so forth would be different, but you'd eventually get to sort of the same thing, like the mammalian form that we talked about in the interview. And the reality is it's somewhere in the middle. But I think, as Simon Conway Morris mentions, and I think I tend to agree with them, that evolution is more convergent, and that if we did rerun the evolutionary tape, as you mentioned, we can't. We just have an N of 1 here. That you get something very similar because that underlying order is sort of dictating what's going to work and what isn't going to work. And that's why you see a lot of things occur over and over again, because there's certain good ways of making a living.
You mentioned mammals. That was a part where I was taking notes during that conversation. He talked about how mammals, he believes, will ultimately win out in the end. And mass extinctions accelerated the rise of mammals. Thoughts on that aspect of it?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. And he argues, and he argues in his book that mass extinctions sort of accelerate the inevitable. And you think about the mammalian form, giving birth to live young rather than laying eggs, protects the young from certain environmental stresses, right? And then being able to regulate your body temperature and warm-bloodedness and having hair, as mammals do, helps protect you from certain environmental stresses. And during the course of history on our planet, you have lots of environmental changes, particularly cold periods, warm periods, cold. So you're going to have these environmental fluctuations, and you're going to have to deal with them as a species. And there's something about the mammalian way of living that allows you to deal with those. And the interesting thing is you see, as he pointed out, that you see some of these mammalian characteristics are highly convergent. They're evolving in certain reptiles, because there's something about that helps you survive in a changing world.
And again, throughout this podcast, a huge goal of ours is, yes, looking at the abundant purpose in nature and the universe, and also the abundant purpose in each one of us. And so I just thought that was significant, that the theory is mammals will win out in the end, and we are mammals. And so is that all part of that intelligent design?
Yeah, no, it's something that, the meta question of evolution, we step back and say, well, why did it play out this way, right? And that's are humans inevitable? And in one of his earlier books, he says inevitable humans in a lonely universe. And he thinks once you get that evolutionary process started, that something like humans, this big-brained mammal that has the ability to manipulate things with their hands, is sort of an inevitable, right? It's the, in a sense, almost like the predestined outcome of evolution. I don't know if he would go that far, but I think that changes the way you look at evolution, right? So when you start to think about it philosophically, it gives you sort of a pause to say, well, is there a direction, a purpose? Are humans written into the evolutionary fabric from the very beginning, as opposed to being sort of a cosmic accident?
Another thing that he said that I thought was really interesting was how social animals never say farewell, and it's because they don't have imagination. They can't foresee the future.
There's a difference in kind between animal minds and human minds, right? There's certain things we humans do, as he pointed out, the animals just don't ever think of doing. That's not in their wheelhouse. It's not in their mental abilities, right?
He also said, no one knows about consciousness. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, to qualify that, and I think where he's saying no one knows why or how consciousness is generated. Why is it that I right now have this conscious 3D experience of Catherine sitting right there, right, and can hear your voice? Why do I have this rich sensory life? All I have is neurons in my brain firing, sending electrical and chemical signals. And we've done a lot to be able to measure the brain and figure out, when this area fires, I have this conscious experience. But nobody has ever put forward a good explanation of why, when neurons in this portion of my brain are firing, I have this wonderfully rich sensory conscious experience, which is, I think what he means, that nobody really gets how that's generated. Consciousness, it's I can't measure it. It's an immaterial thing. My conscious experience, I can describe it to you, but I can't weigh it and so forth. And it's generated by, this. It's related to this massive cells sitting in my skull, right? And how you bridge that gap is one of those great mysteries of biology.
It was a fascinating conversation. Thank you for leading that interview. And I know we'll be unpacking more. There's so much to discuss when it comes to evolution, and we will be unpacking that further in more detail in future seasons. Even, this was kind of an introduction, an overview. Here we are in season 1 when it comes to evolution. But I'd like to go now to the section of our episode where I get to ask you anything. There will be opportunities for our viewers and listeners to send in questions as well. But just to go now to what I like to call the office hours segment of the podcast. So I was doing some podcast prep for this episode and reading an article in Science Magazine. And I should caveat, I don't typically read Science Magazine, but I was trying to, sound intelligent and prepare for you in this episode. And a recent article about this new study that came out about there's a widely used chemical strongly linked to Parkinson's disease. And it was really stunning to me. I'm going to read to you the first 2 sentences from this article. A groundbreaking epidemiological study has produced the most compelling evidence yet that exposure to the chemical solvent, and you're going to have to help me pronounce this chemical, trichloroethylene.
Trichloroethylene.
Thank you. Yep, was not going to get there. Which is common in soil, and this is common in groundwater. It increases the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. The movement disorder afflicts about 1 million Americans, likely the fastest growing neurodegenerative disease in the world. Its global prevalence has doubled in the past 25 years. So now they found this link between this chemical that is common in soil and in groundwater, and it's linked to Parkinson's disease. I think many of us know people who have been affected by this disease, and this was alarming to me because I think I've noticed my generation, and maybe it's women in particular, are becoming just hyper aware of the chemicals that are around us and materials that we use every day, and how this disrupts our body and our endocrine system, for example. So while I have you here as a scientist, as a biologist, what do you make of this news, this chemical Parkinson's connection, and what should we all just keep in mind when it comes to the reality of chemicals around us and how it impacts our body?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the, sort of the side effects of modernity, of technology, right? Is that, the idea of these endocrine disruptors, these chemicals because of pharmaceutical use and so forth, end up in the drinking water and the soil and so forth. And exactly the long-term effects of sort of low-level exposure to these are not really well known. What I would caution is like, well, we don't want to freak out and say, okay, we got to, go seal ourselves off in a bubble. But, and a lot of times people will get stressed more than they should about these things. But, what is it that we can do to prevent Parkinson's? There's things that we know, as you age, the more you exercise, the more you're socially engaged with people, the more you're mentally acute reading and thinking, doing puzzles and sort of things. So there are certain things that we're not just helpless, that we're going to be exposed to these chemicals and we're all going to get Parkinson's, but there's certain things that we can do to try to prevent that. And at the same time, we have to be realistic and think through how, what we're doing with the pharmaceuticals and plastics and so forth that are putting these into the environment.
No, that's really helpful. And I mean, you are the head coach of the cross country team at your university. So I think you're doing a great job of being able to field off, lots of future potential consequences. Okay. And while I have you, this is, again, kind of a personal question, but I think it will hopefully relate to other listeners and viewers as well. So I recently did one of those DNA testing kits.
Right. Yeah.
Gave in and did it and got the results. And something that stood out to me, one of the key results says I have more Neanderthal DNA than 96% of the rest of its
That's why
customers.
we have you on the podcast, right? That's
okay, well, that is my question is like, and I have a friend who had kind of a similar result as well.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And like, should I be alarmed? Do we all have this DNA? What is this?
Yeah. No, it's not as if, I've got more Neanderthal DNA. You're more primitive than everybody.
Kind of worried about.
What we know from human evolution is that as modern humans left Africa, they encountered Neanderthals, and there was some inbreeding with Neanderthals. So we picked up some Neanderthal genetic variants, right? So these Neanderthals that are living in the Middle East and in Europe had certain genetic variants that might affect immunity, pain tolerance, things like that might have been beneficial for living in, they say, colder climates or things like that. And some of those have been maintained in the human genome up into the present time. And it's interesting that most all sort of non-African humans have somewhere between 1% to 2% roughly of these Neanderthal alleles. And just because you have more doesn't necessarily mean that you're more primitive. It's just that these alleles have been beneficial for humans because the Neanderthals had been in this environment for probably 400,000 years before humans move in there. So picking up some of their genetic benefits from them, in a sense, maybe helped out in the process of human evolution as we spread throughout the globe. So
kind of a survivor genes.
Yeah, you might be better off than a lot of other people.
All right. Well, we'll see how that ultimately works out. Well, again, another just great conversation. I learned a lot. I learned a lot from you and Dr. Simon Conway Morris. Any parting thoughts before we let our viewers and listeners go?
Yeah, no, I really, it was a pleasure to interview Dr. Conway Morris, and I would encourage our listeners to pick up one or a couple of his books. I think if you really are interested in the topic of evolution from a scientific perspective and want to see, sort of a sort of fresh take on that, I think his recent book is a great read.
And on that note, I want to let our viewers and listeners know if you want to learn more about this subject in particular and evolution, the Maja Center has a lot of content when it comes to that. So go to the Maja Center website, look at the show notes on this podcast. We'll have some very specific links there as well for you to check out there. That does it for this episode of the Purposeful Lab Maja Center podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, we're going to encourage you to give us that 5-star rating on your podcast platform. Make sure to subscribe, and we can't wait to see you next time.